Grandma Duck was known throughout the town for making the most delicious broth on cold winter days. The rich aroma would fill the air, warming everyone's hearts before they even sat down to eat. It was a recipe passed down through generations, with a special blend of herbs and spices that no one could quite replicate. It was always perfect, just the way Grandma Duck liked it. One chilly afternoon, Grandma Goose came by to visit and had an urgent errand to run. "I must go shopping," she said, her feathers ruffling in the breeze. "Please watch the broth for me, Gus." She handed him a wooden spoon and smiled, knowing she could trust Gus to take care of it. Gus Goose, however, always thought he knew better than anyone else. "Grandma never puts enough pepper in her broth," he muttered to himself, his beak scrunching up in concentration. He grabbed the pepper shaker and added a big helping of pepper, shaking it in with all the force his little wings could muster. "That'll give it some zing," he said, pleased with his work. But Gus Goose, distracted as always, soon remembered he had to visit Clara Club. "Oh dear, I've forgotten about Clara," he exclaimed. "I'll just leave this here and get back to it in a bit." So Gus hurried off, leaving the pot of broth simmering on the stove. Without missing a beat, Gus asked Gyro Gearloose, the inventor goose, to keep an eye on things. "Certainly," cried Gyro, his wings flapping excitedly. As always, Gyro had ideas. He looked at the bubbling pot and rubbed his feathers together. "I think Grandma's broth needs more flavor," he said to himself. "What it really needs is a little spice." He rummaged through his bags of ingredients. He was always prepared and grabbed a jar of hot curry powder. With a grin, he added 2 large spoonfuls of the spicy powder into the broth. "Now that's more like it," he said, proud of his contribution. But Gyro wasn't done yet. He had to visit Uncle Scrooge, so he quickly dashed out of the kitchen, but not before asking Madam Mim, the mischievous witch, to step in and continue stirring the broth. "You know how much I like things done my way," Gyro said, already running out the door. Madam Mim arrived on her broomstick with a loud swish and landed with a cackle. She hummed, eyeing the pot suspiciously. She had her own thoughts about the recipe. "Grandma never puts in enough mustard," she scoffed. Without a second thought, she grabbed a tin of mustard powder and, with a flick of her wand, poured half the tin into the broth. "That should do the trick," Madam Mim chuckled to herself as she stirred the simmering concoction. Everyone gathered around, and Grandma Duck ladled the steaming broth into bowls for each of her friends. Gus eagerly dipped his spoon into the bowl, anxious to try the dish he had overseen. He tasted it, and then, with his feathers puffed out, he squawked loudly, "Yowk, it's hot." Gyro, ever the inventor, took a sip next. His eyes widened in shock. "Hell, water," he cried, feeling the heat of the broth burning his mouth. "I didn't think it would be this hot." Madam Mim, who had been eagerly anticipating the broth, tasted it and immediately jumped back in surprise. "Yeet," she screeched, her face turning bright pink. "I'm on fire," she hollered, frantically waving her hands to cool down her mouth. Grandma Duck took a tiny spoonful of the broth, her eyes squinting as the intense flavors hit her. She winced. "Ew," she exclaimed, "we can't eat that." The broth was a chaotic mess of heat, spice and tang, a far cry from the comforting warmth it was supposed to bring. But despite the disaster in the kitchen, Grandma Duck had a backup plan. She had baked potatoes in their jackets to keep everyone warm, just in case something went wrong. She placed the potatoes on the table, and everyone dug in, relieved to have something tasty to eat. "Well, at least we can enjoy these potatoes," Gus said, taking a big bite. As everyone sat around the table, munching on the potatoes, they all chuckled at their misfortune. "I suppose Grandma was right all along," Gyro said with a wink. "Too many cooks to spoil the broth." Grandma Duck smiled, shaking her head. "Yes, you're all very well-meaning, but I think from now on, I'll keep the recipe to myself," she chuckled, "for too many cooks spoil the broth." Her friends agreed wholeheartedly. From then on, they would always leave the cooking to Grandma Duck, who had the perfect touch for making the best broth in town. And as they all sat around the table, enjoying their potatoes, they knew they'd learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the best thing to do is to trust the expert in the kitchen. As the laughter and chatter filled the room, Grandma Duck couldn't help but smile at her friends. It was one of those rare moments where the mishaps turned into memories. She knew, of course, that the broth disaster wasn't their fault after all. They were only trying to help. But as she looked around at the faces of her friends, each one of them still shaking their heads and chuckling at their overspiced experience, she knew a valuable lesson had been learned. Sometimes, it wasn't just the recipe that mattered, but the joy of coming together with friends. The next day, Grandma Duck made her famous broth again, this time with no interference. She carefully measured each ingredient, her wings moving with practiced grace as she stirred the pot. When it was ready, she invited her friends over for another round. This time, there were no surprises, just a delicious, perfectly seasoned broth. Gus, Gyro, and Madame Mim all took a sip, savoring the rich, comforting flavor that only Grandma Duck's special touch could bring. Double quotes this. Gus said, with a satisfied grin, "is what I call perfect broth." Grandma Duck smiled. Sometimes, it's the little things, the right amount of care, the right amount of time that make the biggest difference. And so, as winter settled in and the days grew colder, Grandma Duck continued to cook up her famous broth, the one that no one could replicate but everyone loved. She had learned that while it was nice to share the kitchen with friends, there was something comforting about trusting her own instincts and the knowledge she had gained over the years. And, of course, every time her friends gathered at her table, they knew one thing for sure. Too many cooks did spoil the broth, but the right cook could turn an ordinary meal into a memory that would last forever.